And now in Module 2, what we're going to go ahead and elaborate on, now that we've learned about the basics of language, we're going to look at language development and really focus in this module on a few different theories about how we go ahead and have language and master that. So what we're going to first look at is what's called the nativist perspective, and it subscribes to something called a language acquisition device. And so the idea here is that we have an inborn mechanism that allows us to master language, and that there are areas of our brain that are equipped to identify certain universal features of language. So there's also been this observation that there is universal grammar, a system of common rules and properties for learning any of the world's languages. And based on this universal grammar came the theory from Noam Chomsky, who was a famous linguist, of this language acquisition device that somehow was embedded within us, and it allows us to go ahead and pick up language wherever we are, and that our brains are especially attuned to that. So we do know there are areas of the brain that do specialize in language, and that children really acquire an incredibly complex communication system really, really rapidly. If you look at some of the stages, and just within a couple of years, they've totally mastered a language that they'd never been exposed to prior. And that children progress through the same kind of sequences roughly at the same age, and even make the same kind of errors regardless of the type of language that they're learning. So there's certainly evidence of a capacity for learning language that's somehow genetic for us. Now, there are a couple of major limitations in regards to the nativist perspective in the language acquisition device there, that LAD. And it's that it doesn't really explain language development, and it underestimates the contribution of the child's language environment. In other words, how much we get exposed to. We don't simply come out, hear very minimally a language and pick it up. We are usually immersed in it. People are helping correct us, and there's all these other things going on at the same time. So if you look at the graph there in the middle of the slide, you can see how the language acquisition device might work. And you can see it goes from having input, and then the language acquisition device uses existing knowledge and the processing skills to generate the things that we are talking about in Module 1, which is phonology, semantics, morphology, syntax. All of that's going to determine how a child would understand others' speech, and then, of course, producing speech on their own. So that's one perspective. The interactionist perspective there that I have, we're going to be coming back to that. But before we get to that, I want to go on to the learning theory. And Bandura, Skinner, a couple of theorists that you might remember from back in Chapter 2, and the learning theories that we talked about there with operant and classical conditioning, and then observational learning too. And so what learning theory would say is that reinforcement leads to language. So while it does a good job here explaining things like phonology and semantics, it doesn't explain how syntactical or novel kind of experiences are incorporated into a child's language. But I will say there is something to be said about a learning perspective, because if you think about it, what is one of the first words that a child typically says? Hopefully most of you think of mama or dada. Now, if you think about it, most of the time we don't call our fathers dada, dad maybe. But one of the reasons that we have that, as we'll talk about, is because it's easy to say, and then it gets reinforced once those words are uttered. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next module, but just kind of thinking about it. So now I'm going to rewind the slides just a little bit to get back to the interactionist perspective. So far, just as a review, we have the nativist perspective with the language acquisition device, and then we have the learning theorists who say it's the environment. And each one kind of complements each other. And so what we see then is the interactionist perspective, which is a combination of the two. And what this is saying is that the children's biologically based competencies, okay, the nativist perspective, and their language environment, the learning perspective, interact together and they shape the course of language development. And so this happens through a variety of mechanisms that we'll go back to here on the following slides here. And one of the illustrations of an interactionist perspective is something called child-directed speech, or sometimes referred to as motherese. And this describes the speech adults use with their young children. These are usually short, simple sentences that these children then the mothers or parents will speak slowly and then in a high-pitched voice. So short, simple sentences spoken slowly and in a high-pitched voice. And so you could go, "Oh, yes, is that a cat? A cat? Why, yes, that's a cat. Cat." Okay, so you notice what happened to me. I used a lot of intonation that I typically wouldn't. So if I was speaking normally to you all, I would say, "Hey, is that a cat?" And you notice there is subtle little inflections, intonations that rise and fall. But when you have a young child, you automatically almost go ahead and slow down. Is that a cat? Okay. And you over intonate. And you're doing that to really kind of emphasize the parts that as the child becomes more of a master of the language, you can say it in a much more subtle way and they will pick up on it. But right now you're hammering them over the head with, "This is what this sounds." And it's that repeated exposure that's slowing down. Now, interestingly, we default to that anytime people do not seem to understand what we are saying language-wise, even if it is in a foreign country. And so, if you're saying, like, "Where's the bathroom?" and you happen to be in Mexico, and the person looks at you and, "Okay, where's the bathroom? Okay, where's the bathroom?" Now, that's not going to help us because it's still in English. And if someone does not speak English and you're asking them a question in a foreign country, you're going to be out of luck. But it shows the power of the default. When someone doesn't understand, we tend to slow down and over enunciate the various parts of speech. So I always think motherese or child-directed speech is a kind of a fun little activity. And what you'll find is almost all adults, when dealing with young children, will lapse into this. There's nothing that we somehow need to be told to do this that people just typically do when they're trying to interact with young children. Another thing in the interactionist perspective, in addition to this child-directed speech, is something called expansion. Now, expansion is where you provide a more grammatically complete expression of the same thought that a child might have. And so if a child goes, "Kitty, goad," you go, "Oh, yes, the cat went into the car." Okay, see what I did there? I didn't say they were wrong. I didn't say, you don't say that. All I simply did is say the same idea the child had, but I said it in a more grammatically complex way and a more complete way to make yourself understood. And so the children, they're used to this. They're picking up on this, and that expansion is going to help them because they're hearing it, and next time they may say a more complete sentence that makes it a lot easier for the listener who speaks English also. Okay. Now, there is a critical or sensitive period that we have to keep in mind with language development. Usually the old saying, "the earlier the better." That is very true in learning language. And they find that there is this kind of critical period even for second language learners. So typically, if you can do it before the age of 10, that's the best. But of course, as young as possible. So exposing a child to a second language even at 2-3 months of age, really key, because when the experience part goes in, what we start to do is prune away in our brain the capability of saying certain sounds. And so if you want to avoid that, if you want to sound like a native speaker with a second language, you want to have exposure for that child to that language as early as possible. And so usually the first few years of life is when you want to start getting a second language. Like I said, 10 is about as late as it is. And if you pick it up in high school or in adulthood, you're always going to have an accent, an English accent, or whatever your primary language. That's going to be the accent you have, no matter how long you speak the language, how long you've been in the country, and speaking the language fluently, you'll always have an accent. So that's why it's important. The earlier, the better. So language development is going to depend on the maturation of cognitive abilities, like the capacity for symbolic thought, which we talked about back in chapter 7 with Piaget and his whole symbolic capacity, which is the end, remember, of the sensory motor stage. So language is a fascinating thing. Of course, Vygotsky talked about it as being one of our primary tools of being able to express and learn, and have our development of our cognitive capacity and skills. And so really important there. So we're going to delve a little bit more now into the lifespan now that we've talked about the theory and the components of language. And that is things that occur right before a child says their first word, and then what happens after those first words start coming. So that's in Module 3.